There's a lot of history behind these movements that dates back, well into the 80s, of emerging movements that were actually trying to formalize a version of what we would come to recognize now as our doctrine, with the restoration of apostles and prophets as offices of the church. So that's not something new, and I think that, of course, had had quite an impact on Pentecostalism as it was emerging in the early to mid 1900s. And this is not the first time that the Assemblies of God has actually confronted this issue of charismatic doctrine leading to the establishment or attempted establishment of practices that we saw, for example, with the New Order of the Latter Rain. I think what would then separate classical Pentecostalism from the NAR is very specifically this focus and somewhat of an intense focus on the idea of establishing offices of apostle and prophet to help lead the church through an end times eschatology that doesn't typically align with most Pentecostal beliefs about end times eschatology. And in fact, much of the time conflicts directly with what has been considered classically Assemblies of God doctrine on eschatology. And so there is an emphasis, or maybe an overemphasis, on elevating man and these positions and these offices as we see the end times approaching in a way that differs significantly from a lot of other Christian movements. And NAR is very distinctively about these apostles and prophets who will help establish and lead the end times church through various different visions of what that could look like.
Right. The idea that they are giving new revelation, new strategies for the church to take dominion of the earth prior to Christ's return, which really would be at odds with what other Christians believe about the end times, and particularly the Assemblies of God, from what I understand, which would hold to the pre-tribulational rapture as really a core doctrine. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I would say that the pre-tribulation rapture is probably a primary viewpoint that is held by most Assemblies of God and affirmed by most Assemblies of God pastors historically. I think that there has been some amount of over time, maybe some slightly different variations of that, but absolutely the doctrine of the rapture itself is codified into fundamental truths. So when we start talking about Dominionism, for example, and this idea that somehow the church must accomplish a seven-mountain mandate, just using that particular language from the NAR, that would definitely go against what the teaching of the Assemblies of God would be comfortable with in its pulpits.
Right, and New Apostolic. I wasn't even planning on going into all this, but it's just this is all so relevant and fascinating to me. But New Apostolic Reformation leaders like Chris Vallotton, for example, the prophet at Bethel Church in Reading, the most prominent in our church today, the most influential probably in the world, and as many know, is also under heavy criticism right now and exposure. But Chris Vallotton, the prophet at that church, and many other leaders, NAR leaders, will really go after the doctrine of the pre-tribulational rapture. And they actually see it, the idea that believers will be raptured first prior to the establishment of Christ's kingdom on earth. You know, that just really flies in the face of NAR doctrines, NAR teachings, that it's under their leadership that Christians will usher in God's kingdom and really establish at least much of it prior to Christ's return.
Yeah, Bethel calls their viewpoints on end times as victorious eschatology, which we would all agree God wins, right? There's no question about who is ultimately in authority. And when we see the redemptive arc from Genesis to Revelation, we see that there is if you will, a train for all of history heading in a specific direction. But the NAR would certainly make it sound as if God is waiting very specifically, and maybe even some of the language says he cannot or will not be able to return until we have accomplished certain things given to us to accomplish. I think it was even maybe in one of Bill Johnson's books where he said something to the effect of, God has dreams that may not come true if we do not do our part. And that's just a very unorthodox view of the sovereignty of God without question. And certainly doesn't paint the picture that we see in the scripture, where we see a God who sees beginning from end and calls things into being exactly as and on the exact timelines that are determined. So with that in mind, I think that NAR definitely has a unorthodox view of the sovereignty of God, and that certainly is influential in their understanding of end times and so-called victorious eschatology, where the church must conquer all these specific. And you know this well from your research too, Holly. There's a lot of debate on what that means. Like, how sufficiently do we have to conquer? Which mountains do we sufficiently have to conquer, and to which degree? And there is no understanding or consensus from these so-called prophets and apostles on that. But the fact that just differentiates, or I'm sorry, differs so much from much of Orthodox, Christianity, evangelical Christianity, that it definitely is seemingly a distinctive of the NAR.
Yeah, regardless of your view of the timing of the rapture, pre-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath, post-trib, regardless of your view, NAR doctrine deviates significantly from all of those, historic or those typical understandings of those doctrines. And even many NAR leaders will claim to be post-millennialists. Some claim to be all-millennialists, like Randy Clark. Mike Bickle claims to be premillennialists. But their understandings of those historic doctrines, premillennialism, all-millennialism, post-millennialism, deviate significantly from those doctrines historically. And they put a NAR twist on all of them, which you referred to as victorious eschatology.
And always requires, on some level, apostles and prophets to lead us there, regardless of that particular viewpoint.
Right. Apostles and prophets are essential to all of those views. Yes. Okay. Well, that was a rabbit trail I wasn't planning on going into, but good.